Previously.
The scale of what's happened is mind-boggling. So a sort of peasant man is born in a small village, fails his exams a few times, is given a sort of hastily translated Bible, which he only reads at a fairly low point in his life, decides that it's sort of about him, and then takes the exams again, fails them again, really doubles down on the religion, has a few friends follow him, they take over 4 villages. And then, at this point, I've lost track, but more than 100,000 people have died. And he is the ruler of the most important city in China.
Adam, welcome back to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Just for our listeners, it's been actually a couple weeks since we recorded part 1. We thought we'd be continuing, but this has been a behemoth of a topic. So
oh yeah,
we're back. And it's been, a week for our listeners as well.
Mm-hmm.
What do you remember about this Taiping rebellion, Adam?
In the 19th century, there was a man who eventually came to be known as Hong Xiuquan. He was from a fairly rural area of China, took some exams to get into the sort of state bureaucracy, get a good, cushy government job, failed those exams twice, and then after the second time he failed, started reading some Christian religious texts, took the exams again, failed those exams, had a vision that he was the brother of Jesus Christ, and gathered together a motley crew of people who he convinced that he was the brother of Jesus Christ. They started sort of conquering villages, and it all got a bit out of hand, and they started conquering cities as well. Were pushed around by the Qing dynasty governorate. Lots and lots and lots of people died, and we ended the story with Hong Xiuquan having control of... Was it Nanjing that he had control of?
Yeah, correct.
Wow.
I've been referring to it as in the older translation of Nanking, but yes.
Okay.
So he was able to take control of Nanking, which at the time was debatably the most important city of China. I mean, the capital was Beijing, but Nanking was the historic capital of the south. It was right in the middle of China. It controlled all these waterways, the hub of trade, the hub of agriculture. It was China's largest city as well.
Well, Jing or King means capital in China, in Chinese.
It means southern capital, right?
Yeah, so Beijing is northern capital. Yeah.
So that's where we left off. Our heavenly king now has a heavenly kingdom that he set off and found and miraculously conquered. So let's dive into it. As with before, my sources are largely 2 books. God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence.
A very funny name for a book. Don't know why, just is.
And Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom by Stephen Platt. And I have used some articles from the Journal of Asian Studies to sort of verify some things. But largely, my sources are those 2 books because those 2 have delved so deeply into the Chinese record and the British record that it covers a lot of stuff pretty extensively. Which is kind of the point of historical books. If you got people that can round it all together for you, that's great. Just check about what they've omitted and what they haven't. And I only noticed this today as I was carrying this book back here. Do you know how some publishers will use a quote from a famous person on the back of a book sort of to draw interest when someone picks it up off the shelf? This endorsement of Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom made me go, oh no. Here's the quote. Autumn in the Heavenly Kingdom is a fascinating work by a first-class historian and superb writer, said by Henry Kissinger.
Oh no.
Exactly. That was my... But as we know, this story is a lot about espionage and subversion of Asian established nations. Yeah,
really messing up Asia. So
I'm sure he read this and got some ideas of, wow, I could have done so much more. But yeah, that made me go, oh no. However, I don't think that his endorsement subverts the historic research that went into the book.
Sure.
At least in my mind. You can have your opinions. But let's dive in. Hong Xiuquan has become the heavenly king of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And let's look at what life is like in this kingdom. It can kind of be as expected based on what we have heard so far. As you heard before, the camps, the military camps, the boats, everything was separated by sex. So like the men would be off somewhere, the women and the children would be somewhere else. There was strict upholding of Christian morality, but this Christian morality as interpreted by the god worshippers, as they were known. Just like in Canton or Guangzhou, before the First Opium War, trade was banned in Nanking within the city walls.
As in trade with foreign nations.
So anyone not within the kingdom.
Oh, so even like Qing people.
The Qing are the demons, so it's banned with them as well.
Wow.
Women and children are moved into the city. Fighting age men are moved to the walls or the defensive towns around the city. If you are caught smoking opium, your severed head would be put on full display.
Wow.
And there would be 10 cannon shots fired twice a day as a call to prayer. You might be wondering what's going on with other religions of the people that are living within this fairly large kingdom, which was, bigger than the size of any European nation at the time other than Russia. That is their continental borders. It was larger than Britain, larger than France.
You mean China as a whole? Or
no, I mean the Taiping
Heavenly Kingdom.
Heavenly Kingdom,
Okay.
because they had controlled all of these cities that they had conquered on the way.
Right.
They abandoned control of the far west, like Guangxi, but they pretty much had control of the Yangtze River Valley, which is a very large area of central China, essentially splitting the Qing dynasty in half in a majority of places. So Taoist and Buddhist temples, some were centuries old, are looted and burned to the ground, and the monks were told to either convert to the god worshippers' religion or die. Many were killed. And as a side note, this is kind of the travesty of modern China when you're visiting, because there are a lot of temples within cities these days, and they're big tourist attractions. But a good 98% are reconstructions done by Deng Xiaoping in like the 80s and 90s. Because if a temple wasn't destroyed by Taiping rebels or destroyed by the British, they were destroyed by Mao.
Yeah.
In the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Pretty much all of these hindrances to progress, as he put it, were destroyed back in the 50s. So it's a real shame that most of these temples are just reconstructions, albeit usually done very well, but ultimately more of an amusement park than a cultural heritage, since it is just a new construction, right?
That's true. However, and this is slightly off topic, but food for thought for the audience. One of the first art exhibitions that I went to where I sort of felt that I understood what it was about, I was quite late to like getting art, was the Ai Weiwei exhibit at the Royal Academy in like 2017, maybe, about then, 2016, 2017. And there's a famous Ai Weiwei piece of him dropping these, I believe, Ming Dynasty vases. And there's like 3 shots of one of him holding it, one of it falling, and one of it smashing on the ground. And the reaction was, how could you destroy this ancient artifact? But then in context, he does a lot of stuff with these vases, and he makes the case that, like, look, these vases are still made in the same place, from the same materials, in the same way, by the descendants of people who made them hundreds of years ago. So is it really different? And actually, in doing so, casting doubt as to whether he actually was dropping a Ming Dynasty vase or not. But I thought that sort of focusing on age as being the thing itself was an interesting thing to think about, at least.
It is food for thought. I think with religious structures, it might be a little different because most of the people that are rebuilding it are not building it with the same intent that the original people built it with, especially somewhere like China where religion has shifted dramatically in the past 200 years.
Yeah.
So food for thought. Everyone can have their take on it. But I appreciate that perspective.
Leave a comment with your opinion on whether the reconstructed temples are authentic.
Yeah, leave a comment. Head over to YouTube. Not many people are over on the YouTube side, but leave a comment.
But you can leave comments on Spotify now.
Oh, really? Yeah, leave a comment. So yeah, the Taoists and the Buddhists were cracked down on very heavily. But for some reason, that still remains fairly unclear. The mosques were left intact and Muslims were largely left alone, even more so than other Christians.
Was there a big Muslim presence?
Not in Nanking necessarily. There were historic mosques and they existed for the purpose of traders historically.
Right.
But there are other places, like I think Xi'an had a larger Muslim population historically. There are other parts of China that had more Muslims, but not necessarily Nanking. There were 200 Catholic converts that were given very harsh treatment until they converted. And one of those was if they did not convert by a certain time frame, they were sent to the front lines. The 200 Catholics quickly dwindled in Nanking.
Right.
Because remember, at the time, there had not been the allowance of Christian missionaries to roam freely in China. So the Christians that were there through very particular means. Now, the rebels had spent a lot of their time conquering, right? Their whole lives had been dedicated towards this rebellion, this conquest. But now they kind of had some time to sit and relax a little bit. They started printing their version of the Bible, the one they'd kind of crossed out a bunch of stuff, ripped out some pages, made a ton of notes. Now this was made official. And even then, they started to cut out stories where certain parts of the biblical history and the biblical stories, especially when it came to sexual themes or anything related to drunkenness, they just were ripped out of there too. The court of Hong Xiuquan was evaluating the Bible. We're like, nope, gotta go. This has to go. This has to go. And with each year, Hong decides to remove more full passages entirely. So this interpretation is, I mean, I guess they still view it as the word of God, but they also view Hong as a god. So what he says goes, right? The armies are split into 3 parts. 1 to defend Nanking or Nanjing, 1 to consolidate power on the Yangtze River, and 1 to push north to threaten Peking or Beijing itself.
So that feels like a fairly fractured force.
A very large force still,
Right.
but less central than it was. And again, this is 1853 was when they took over Nanking. And it's worth noting, as a reminder, that the Qing had been pretty severely kneecapped, I suppose, by the First Opium War, which ended in about 1840. So they still hadn't had the full chance to really recover at the time. During this time of relative peace, Hong works with scholars and philosophers in the city because this was a capital of learning in China. So a lot of these Confucian scholars, these philosophers, they decided to remain. They didn't really have anywhere else to go, but a lot of them submitted to the new world order they saw. And he works with them to consolidate his rule on a moral and spiritual and civic level, using the old structures of power to consolidate his rule amongst the masses. There was an official proclamation that Peking is now to be renamed Demon's Den, which is Yao Shui, I think.
Okay.
So that's the official, you have to call Beijing Yao Shui, the Demon's Den. Since Peking or Beijing means northern capital, that is now seen as a lie. And it's illegal to call it that for punishment by death, since there is no capital other than Nanjing, the southern and heavenly capital. The other areas that they control are fortified to an extreme level. Like I said, almost every able-bodied man is sent out. All the peasants are rallied to fortify this kingdom. You may also be thinking about the European response to all of this. At first, many Protestants saw this as an opportunity to Christianize China when they first heard about this rebellion going on. You know, they're like, oh, Christians are rising up in China, which had been such a hard nut to crack for Christian missionaries for so long, and seen as an almost impossible task to convert China to Christianity. So many saw this as a great thing at first, though many abandoned this hope when they learned the truth behind the Christianity that the God worshippers were practicing in China.
Do you have an idea for how this information came to them?
This still came through the trade that was going on.
Right.
So after the First Opium War, 5 ports were opened to Europeans rather than just the one. And one of those was Shanghai, which is fairly close to Nanjing. And so you still have a lot of word of mouth traders coming from internal parts of China to trade with Europeans in Shanghai, which was technically owned by the Qing, but really operated by Britain. And so these people were hearing from others that had been to the Heavenly Kingdom what it was like. They were then going back to Britain. They were going to Singapore, going to Malaysia, and sort of reporting back to the rest of the British world, or the French were going back to Vietnam, Indochina at the time they called it, and reporting back. So it was really word of mouth from people to and from.
And this was 1853, so before the United States was a world power, really. But do you have any indication of what was said about it in the US?
I'm getting there. That's my sort of my next points. Yeah,
excellent.
Starting with the British, the Taiping were pretty much written off from the start by Sir George Bonham, who was the captain of the British forces in Shanghai. And these names with the British are kind of weird because if you've traveled in Asia, like in Hong Kong and Singapore, there are so many buildings and streets named after like Bonham and Elgin and those types of people who play big factors in this story, who in reality, like, were pretty bad dudes. But yeah, Sir George Bonham wrote him off, and he thought it was just spurred as, quote, superstition and nonsense after meeting with a few Taiping officials outside of Nanjing, because his curiosity brought him to the table to see if they would be a legitimate nation to participate in diplomatic affairs with. He said, no, they're superstitious and nonsensical. The French envoy was extremely impressed with the law and order in Nanjing, and negotiations go well until the envoy mentions the Qing emperor's name, thus implying Qing legitimacy and implying a rebellion from the Taiping, where they were then kicked out, and no further negotiations with the French was done. In 1854, America sends an envoy on the ship the Susquehanna, which was actually Matthew Perry's flagship to Japan 1 year prior.
Wow. Oh, so they were doing the rounds at that point.
Yeah, I think he'd returned to America, but it was his ship.
Oh, so they'd already been to Japan at that point?
Yeah, it was 1 year before they went to Japan.
Okay, right.
Because the Yangtze is so deep, these gunboats can travel up to Nanjing fairly quickly from Shanghai. So they actually dock in Nanjing, and 8 crewmen, American crewmen, try to sneak into the city out of curiosity, and they're interrogated and beaten before being sent back to the ship. But that didn't hinder America's interest in expanding operations in China. They were kind of the new kids on this front, and they saw the Taiping as an opportunity to undermine British established diplomacy with the Qing. So they still kept trying, as they saw it as a big share of the market. But they also seek to give the movement a, quote, truly Christian direction. That's their main goal. But they're still kept at an arm's distance by the Taiping rebels, who kind of see that as something that these outsiders want to do. Hong was very aware that they wouldn't like his interpretation of Christianity. Now, guns and supplies began to flow from Shanghai to Nanking, along with recruits from European nations. There were a lot of mercenaries that were hanging out in Shanghai waiting for stuff to happen, and a lot of them found some readily available gold in Nanking. They came to join the kingdom. They couldn't just sit idly by. There was that push north, as I said. A third of the army went north. In 1853, the Taiping forces pushed north to try to capture Peking. However, they do run into some obstacles. The Qing have moved the boats on the Yellow River. So the Yellow River, or the Huanghe River, it's extremely deep, extremely wide, similar to the Yangtze. Again, I'm going to call it the Yellow River because that's sort of the dated term that the book from the 90s uses. There was a big shift in academia after that. But the terrain is unfamiliar to these new recruits as well, and most of the established troops were from central or southern China. In October, the Taiping come within 3 miles of Tianjin, which is the port city nearest Beijing.
It's very far north as well.
It's very far north. But they're stopped by a wave of northern forces, including a huge portion of it being Mongolian cavalry, which they had also not faced that type of soldier before. They also have lost the goodwill of the people of the north, which also made things difficult for them. Running low on food and supplies, the Taiping army, who had previously been winning over the peasants of the region because they would support them against their landlords and redistribute the land amongst them.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it would happen again about 100 years later in the same region. But they massacred a whole town to raid it for food and supplies, which then sent a rippling effect of terror across the countryside, fearing that that would then happen to the neighboring towns. By 1855, the Taiping control a sizable portion of central and eastern China. However, the battles are constant. Death and destruction is everywhere. Cities change hands sometimes 4 to 5 times a year. But all the while, Hong Xiuquan stays in his palace as the spiritual leader of this kingdom.
Is there a sense within certainly the historical understanding that you've been reading, the degree to which Hong Xiuquan was running this, or was he the figurehead at the head of this sort of wider power structure?
I would say he had a very strong control over the city of Nanking. He did have those closest advisors to him, those kings, those directionally kings, as we said last time, like the North King, the South
One of
King.
whom died, and Jesus never spoke to him again after that.
That's true. And another one was shot outside that one city. But he kept adding some. We'll see later on. He keeps adding a few. But he would give them control over the armies in that campaign. And what they did widely was autonomous. So he would give an order, like, go defend this region along the river. And they would, but they would go about it in their own way. Like if they felt that it was strategic to abandon this city, they would, and then conquer a new one or retreat at this point, all while maintaining the goal. Like they wouldn't ever return back to Nanking without completing the objective. So he was the central figure, but he did grant them a lot of power to do what they wanted. And through those structures, they had very tight control over the organization of the kingdom. So we'll see where that sort of backfires, and that these were pseudo-military leaders. I say pseudo because they don't actually have formal training, right?
Right.
They're just peasants. But they really don't have experience in administration and food production and running a nation. So we'll see that comes up a bit later as part of their downfall. But first, it had been a while since God had spoken in the heavenly kingdom. As you said, one of his kings, who was the voice of Jesus, was killed, and Jesus no longer spoke to Hong directly. But this is not Jesus talking. This is God himself.
Oh, okay. Oh, so Jesus needed the shaman to speak to Hong Xiuquan, but God could speak directly to the heavenly father versus heavenly brother.
So this does not come from Hong.
Okay.
In December of 1853, the voice of God allegedly comes from the East King, Yang Shu-ching, Hong's administrative leader over the kingdom. This is sort of in the vein that you see in Chinese history sometimes, where the emperor's closest advisor and the strongest administrative force sometimes undermines the emperor, takes some control. And that's kind of what's happening here. Through this guy, Yang Shu-ching, which we can call him Yang, as we've been calling Hong, his family name. Through him, God says that Hong Xiuquan has grown harsh and indulgent. He says that 4 of Hong's concubines, who he specifically names, need to go live at the East King's palace instead.
Of course he did. Okay.
Yeah, his 4 favorite, right?
Yeah.
He says that Hong's 4-year-old son is too self-indulgent as well, and he orders that Hong receive...
4-year-olds are pretty self-indulgent as a category, I would say, but...
Yeah, but he orders that Hong receives 40 blows of the rod as punishment.
Wow.
Now, the structure by which Hong has created this kingdom does not put him in a position to really argue, does it?
I suppose not. Yeah, it would be tough for Hong to then say, no, God didn't say that to you, because God hadn't been speaking to him very much, I guess.
And also when Jesus had spoke, it came through one of the other kings, right?
That is true, yeah.
The directional kings. So it's the same mechanism by which he claims Jesus spoke to him before. So Hong actually prostrates to receive this punishment. But then, just as in the story of Abraham and Isaac, the East King proclaims that God has forgiven him, and it was a test. And then God goes back to heaven, and the East King remembers none of it, allegedly.
Wow. And what of the concubines?
Well, that was the instruction. They have to still go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the concubines did go and live in the East King's house.
Yeah, just the punishment was the test.
Okay. Okay.
Sure. I mean, in reality, there was truth to these allegations. Hong had begun to truly live like the most lavish of emperors, with women assigned to clean individual parts of his body every day.
Wow.
And this begins an internal debate amongst the hierarchy of the Taiping. Hong reluctantly gives Yang the title of, quote, Holy Ghost the Comforter, because that was the mechanism by which he could see in Christianity that God could speak through someone, through the Holy Ghost. So he titles this East King basically the voice of the Holy Ghost.
Okay.
But in turn, Hong solidifies that only those that have actually seen God with their own eyes have the final say on doctrine, meaning Hong, who saw him in his vision back then.
Right. Okay. I see. So he's laying the groundwork for him to be the final authority.
And you can imagine that these like heated debates in this lavish palace would be pretty funny to watch if like the implications weren't so serious that people could just die then and there. As we know, these people are very used to death and destruction.
Oh, yeah.
Yang basically uses this voice of God to drive a wedge between Hong and his other generals and his confidants. And he elevates his own position, too. He uses the scholars of the city to begin sowing theological arguments against Hong and for himself. And he meets with the British secretly and declares that Hong's books are no longer valid as the word of God. This is what he tells them, which then the word spreads amongst some of the merchants and the people that do work with the British. Slowly, Yang takes over the implementation of punishments on officials and demands veneration when he walks by as well. So essentially receiving the treatment of the emperor. And by 1855, Yang had hindered Hong in every possible way he could, denying generals promotions that Hong had granted, undermining the law and punishments going on in the city, even ordering the armies, and sometimes successfully, like he would order the armies to capture a city and they would succeed, which then undermines Hong, who didn't give that order. By 1856, Hong really couldn't take this any longer, and knowing that plots arose to depose of him, he, on September 1st, ordered that Shang's palace be raided, and 6,000 Shang's loyal men were killed, including Shang himself. So the voice of God was silenced by Hong. Now Hong rectifies this situation by posthumously honoring Yang and adopting one of his children, which is not unheard of either in Chinese dynasties, where you depose of an enemy and then adopt their kid sort of as a hostage so the family doesn't take retribution against you.
Wow. Oh, okay, interesting. Yeah.
And creating like an official tie between them and the emperor. So like they also, in Confucian law, wouldn't go against an elder family member.
Right. Okay. Oh, clever.
He's using those Confucian mechanisms of control that have always existed, but putting his own twist on them, basically.
Yeah.
I think now is an important time to mention the Second Opium War. This arose in 1856. And it's interesting to note that this was really when Parliament took power and authority from the monarch in Britain in foreign affairs. Like at this point, memos from the Foreign Office become more important than royal edicts. You really start to see the British Empire through the Parliament, not through the palace.
Yeah.
Now, what caused this Second Opium War? Well, 5 ports were opened to Europeans after the First Opium War, but they were not enough. Europe wanted more. They saw the Qing as weak, particularly weakened by this Taiping Rebellion, obviously, right? They saw this as the perfect time to take more. And Britain sought to legitimize their officials in China. At the moment, even with these concessions, they were not allowed within Beijing, certainly not allowed in any official government building. And they also sought to legalize the opium trade throughout China, which still remained illegal. So there was this ship registered in Hong Kong called the Arrow, and it went up to Canton, and the crew was arrested for smuggling and piracy. And the British saw this as a breach of the treaty, of their right to trade in Canton, and a very convenient excuse to go to war.
Yeah. In fact, I've heard the Second Opium War described as the Arrow War.
I haven't, but that's interesting. And around the same time as the Arrow incident, a French missionary was executed in Guangxi for proselytizing illegally. So the French offered to join the British in this war. Now, I'll keep it brief, but during this Second Opium War, which, as we know, is the time where Hong is consolidating his power in central China, European forces capture Canton in 1857, modern-day Guangzhou. After some fighting up and down the coast, they signed the Treaty of Tianjin in 1858 to open 11 new ports up to the Europeans, but the Qing refused to ratify it, so the fighting continues. As a response, the British take the Taku forts, which are an important fortification in Tianjin on the river mouth of the Hai River, which leads straight to Beijing. And in 1860, the British forces arrive in Peking, aka Beijing, and ultimately burn the Summer Palace to the ground, which is one of the biggest archaeological and cultural tragedies in the 19th century, I'd say.
Yeah, I've been there, and they have a fair few signs up about what horrors the British and French did to the place and how their rebuilding efforts. It's also where I slipped on some polished marble and a security guard laughed at me.
Nice.
Which, given the context, I felt was entirely appropriate.
Yeah, British guy.
Yeah. I don't know if you could tell that by looking at me, but it felt apt.
To anyone who's never seen Adam, it's kind of obvious he's a British guy. He's a handsome British guy, but a British guy nonetheless. But I want to ask you about that, actually. Since we had spoken about rebuilding cultural history before, what effect do you think that has had at the Summer Palace? Because it's obviously a reconstruction.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Summer Palace, going to the Summer Palace and the sort of more historical places in and around Beijing. Beijing's the only part of China that I've been to. They're tourist attractions for a largely Chinese audience. So it would be like going to the Parthenon if the Parthenon had been fully reconstructed. So it was kind of like just going to a museum, really. I think that it was appreciated, and at least for me, appreciated and enjoyed on that level. For a Chinese audience, I can't say how that would have affected them, but I do believe that the majority of people there, when I was there at least, or at least maybe not the majority, but a lot of people who were there when I was there had come from all over the country, maybe with their families, maybe on school trips. It was the only time when I was in China when random strangers asked if they could take a photograph with me. Because people from Beijing see non-Chinese people quite a lot, but if you're visiting Beijing from other parts of the country, maybe you don't.
This was also like quite a while ago, right?
This was 2014, yeah. So this was a while ago.
I wonder if other Chinese leaders had the opportunity to decide whether or not to preserve the destruction of the Summer Palace, they would have as a museum. I know that there is a big effort culturally to sort of forget but not forget the century of humiliation, and that we move forward, and that was the darkest days of Chinese history, at least in the modern era. And that does seem to be the cornerstone of the century of humiliation, is the British burning the Summer Palace and everything in it. And I wonder if maybe, for example, Xi Jinping would have decided to leave that as is, as a reminder of what they will never return to.
Yeah, interesting. Possibly. I compared it to the Parthenon a few minutes ago, and I think that it's interesting comparing it to something like that, which is, of course, or the Colosseum or whatever. I was at the Parthenon a few years ago, and I had the thought, and that because a lot of the stuff when you're there is talking about the preservation efforts and all the things they're doing to preserve the site. I remember thinking, well, why not rebuild it? Right? Why not build it to be a temple as it would have looked like? And people can talk about originality. You could use the same materials made in the same way, or you could use materials that look completely different so you can see what's been reconstructed. Is that a poorer way of remembering a place than having the ruin of it? What is the purpose of leaving it as a ruin? There is a purpose. It is a choice. It might be one of cost, right? But I think questioning and this is getting sort of deep into historical analysis, and it's a real cornerstone question, I think, of historical analysis. You would be better placed to think about this than I. But the way in which we remember things societally and what we publicly choose to commemorate, I think, is a super interesting question, and how we choose to do that is super interesting, and there are implications to that. The central square of any city in Europe will have a man on a horse who died in a battle.
Yeah.
Like that's all over the place. It says a lot about European values at the time. You probably see a lot around like maybe the southern US as well. I'm not so sure. Some of those have probably been pulled down in recent years.
Or guarded with a fence.
And this is also part of the question of how we societally remember things, because it says a lot about what we as a society value, right?
Yeah. And I think the Opium Wars in particular are not ancient and really represents a dark era for everyone involved. Not just the Chinese for their defeat, but the British and the French in their complicity and why they were fighting at all. It really is one of the clearest examples of the brutality of imperialism.
Yeah. I'll give you an example, right? The Second Opium Wars, give me those years.
1856 to 1860.
Okay, and the American Civil War, that was 1861
to 1865, yeah.
Yeah, so immediately following this was the American Civil War. Do you know when the last war widow of the American Civil War died?
I'm going to guess like 1970?
2020.
Really?
Yeah. She married at the age of 17 in 1936 to James Bolin, who was 93 years old at the time.
I'm sure she loved him so much.
This was apparently a fairly common thing where Civil War veterans would marry young women who were maybe like at a disadvantage so that they would get a Civil War pension.
Oh, interesting.
So she got a Civil War pension until 2020. So that's how recent it is. The last widow of a war that happened the year afterwards died 5 years ago.
Yeah, and I think that's something to remember when the ramifications are still felt, but then maybe people in that in-group that were the oppressor say, well, I didn't do it. Well, it's like, well, the history still is felt, you know?
Yeah.
I know you didn't do it. You weren't there. Obviously, you didn't do it.
Yeah.
Those are some important things to consider. Now, the Second Opium War ended with the Convention of Peking, where the Century of Humiliation is essentially codified. Every important Chinese port, including on the rivers, are given free reign of the Europeans. Now, I say every important port because you'll often see like 20-ish ports were given. But I did a project in my master's program where I mapped every port that Europeans controlled in the late 1800s, and it was well past 110. I still have the map of all the different influence of, including the Japanese, the Russians, all of them. But
you should upload that map to our socials. That's cool.
I will. Yeah, I will. The number is usually understated. Now, foreign dignitaries are now allowed in the Imperial Palace for the first time, which is a huge cultural blow to the Chinese. Christian missionaries are now given permission to operate freely throughout China, and full legalization of the opium trade is implemented as well. Kowloon, which is the peninsula opposite Hong Kong Island, is ceded to the British, and massive payments are given to Britain and France from the Qing. There are kind of some important players that came into effect during the Second Opium War. One of them is Lord Elgin, who I thought was worth a mention. He's sent to China in 1857 by the Queen herself to negotiate the opium trade. So those that say that Victoria didn't have an influence on this, she specifically instructed him to negotiate the opium trade and to seek reparations from the Chinese along the way. His father is the same Lord Elgin of Elgin Marbles fame, which now that we're talking about cultural preservation and the Parthenon, you want to just mention what that's about?
The British Museum in London has several very beautiful Greek statues, predominantly now known as the Parthenon marbles, historically known as the Elgin marbles, because they were stolen from Athens by Lord Elgin during a war with the Ottomans.
Yeah, and you'll see people defend like the British Museum keeping all of their stuff by saying, how could we possibly give these back to this country that might be at civil war in a few years and we lose it all? It's like, you really think that about Greece, bro? But anyway, I think Greece places a huge emphasis on that. You went to the Parthenon. Did you see? I know they highlight where they should be in there.
I went looking for that bit where they have that, but it was closed for repair work, renovation works or something at that time. So I saw the space where it would be, but I couldn't get up close to it.
They were preparing to receive them.
Yeah.
Keep it tidy. They'll be here any day. Yeah. But yeah, so that was this guy's son was the one sent to China, and he's the one that ordered the burning of the Summer Palace. Lord Elgin is consistently invited to Hong's court during his business on the Yangtze River because of his importance in the British Empire, but he ignores Hong the whole time. His arrival marks the escalation of the Second Opium War, and like I said, he was the one that burned the Summer Palace to the ground due to sort of the opening of free travel of missionaries and people working on behalf of the British Empire throughout China. Someone comes back into the story that hasn't been around for a very long time, and that's Hong's cousin, who shares the same last name, so Hong Rungan. He was one of Hong's original followers, and like I said, his cousin. And he had been in Hong Kong for about a decade at this point, learning the ways of the foreigners, particularly under the tutelage of Issachar Roberts, an American missionary who we'll get into in a bit. But ultimately, he returns now to Nanking for the first time, and he teaches Hong what he has learned about the foreigners in Hong Kong. He provides a more formal form of Protestant Christianity, which Hong was pretty eager to learn about in terms of just what the Europeans thought and how they interpreted the Bible, which is also kind of implemented in the kingdom somewhat, but not within Hong's inner circle. He brings Hong some ideas for modernization, such as adopting Western technology, such as steamships, railways, and modern firearms. He urges trade with the West, especially with the Opium War beginning. That was when he first arrived in Nanking. and explained that getting France and Britain on their side was crucial because they didn't know how this war would play out. It might have been an opportunity for the Taiping rebels to take control. And he urged the formation of a nation state in the European sense rather than the theocratic kingdom that Hong was striving for. Hong Xiuquan listened to his cousin, but he didn't really implement many of his ideas, as he felt that they would undermine his authority as a god king. How can you have a liberal nation state when you are a theocratic king?
Right.
It did, however, encourage Hong to import weapons from nearby Shanghai, which was quickly becoming an even more important base for Britain than Hong Kong after the Second Opium War. Eventually, Hong began to covet the city itself, which he saw as being his gateway to Taiping legitimacy, a place where the world could come and witness the glory of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. So, based on what Hong learned and his new desire to take Shanghai, particularly because their treasuries would be able to supply the Taiping with enough firepower to influence and win all of China, Hong sends his friend and his first convert, Li Shucheng, and he tasks him with leading the assault of Shanghai, which he then begins in August of 1860. He gives instruction that anyone who puts a yellow flag in their home or on a church window will be spared.
Again, very biblical.
Very biblical, yes. The Taiping believed that the foreigners would honor their position of neutrality, which they historically had in the conflict so far. And they insisted to the British and the French that this assault on Shanghai was purely to purge the Qing demons out of the city, because they saw it as a Qing city. Whereas at this point, after the Second Opium War, the Europeans kind of saw it as their city. The foreigners actually took up arms against the Taiping, and their firepower caused the Taiping to retreat because the British cannons, the French cannons were a lot more powerful than the Qing ones. Hong continued to issue edicts from behind the comfort of his walls, each one altering the doctrine of his religion based on new missionaries and books that were coming from Shanghai and Hong Kong into the city. Now, I mentioned him before, but Isaac R. Roberts became a pretty influential figure. He's actually probably responsible for handing Hong the original book. We mentioned that it was a Westerner that had snuck into Canton, and we have no way of knowing if that was actually Isaac R. Roberts, because neither specifically remembered, as it was a very long time ago in their lives at this point. But that was something he was doing, and probably one of the only guys doing that. Very likely he's the man that put that original book in Hong's hand. But he is a missionary from the U.S. He's a Southern Baptist, and he actually denied Hong baptism in Canton in 1847, and it's unclear why in the historical record, but we know that that happened. Finally, 13 years later, he accepts Hong's invitation after many, many years. You know, there was all these rules about foreigners coming into the Heavenly Kingdom, but consistently in his letters to his cousin in Hong Kong, he was inviting Roberts to his kingdom. He wanted this guy's input because he was one of the influential people of Christianity in China at the time, and sort of one of the guys that interpreted this Bible that influenced Hong so much. But he accepts his invite in 1860, especially now that the treaty signed by the British allows foreigners to travel freely through China. So he's able to get up there easily. Hong actually offers him the position of foreign minister, but Roberts declines it. They together issue a call for more Protestants to come live in the Heavenly Kingdom. And the reason Roberts came to Nanjing was to correct Hong's interpretation of Christianity. But as soon as he gets there, he realized that that would not be possible.
Okay.
And he would be forced to preach Hong's version of the Bible. And he agrees, probably out of self-preservation, but secretly hopes to eventually replace their Bible with the King James Version over time. Mm-hmm. At this point in time, Hong is growing very paranoid, especially after the incident before with the voice of God. And he's seeing fewer and fewer people in person. But Roberts is one of the few people allowed to see Hong at this point. And after several years of operating in the city, he reaches all these brick walls. And theological disagreements become too much. Roberts leaves Nanjing for Shanghai in January of 1862. And there's a quote that I read that Roberts said when asked about Hong, and you know a lot more about Greek philosophy than me.
Okay, I don't know a ton. I want to make that clear, but...
No, you still know a lot more than me, so okay. I was wondering if this meant anything to you, and you can read the quote and then explain the quote.
Okay, I'll
Because
try.
when asked about Hong, this is what Roberts said.
His Grace, the Archbishop of Nanjing, as a sham Diogenes of former days and would-be Plato among missionaries. So Diogenes was a philosopher who was famous for not giving a shit. Like, he gave a shit less than anybody else in history. He's kind of Rick Sanchez, actually, Diogenes. Like,
Okay.
there is a famous story how he lived in a barrel, and then one philosopher was described men as a featherless biped, and he came with a plucked chicken and said, "Behold a man." And once Alexander the Great, having heard of Diogenes, came to him and said, "What can I, Alexander, King of Kings, do for Diogenes?" And Diogenes said, "You could get out of my son."
I've heard these stories, so that's the guy.
Yeah, so that's him. Plato among missionaries. I think that's just him describing himself as wanting to be a philosopher. And so as I understand it, His Grace the Archbishop of Nanjing.
That's the condescending title he's given him, right?
Very dry, classic dry British insult. And a sham Diogenes of former days and would be Plato among missionaries is saying he wants to be this religious philosopher, basically, but he is not.
So this is indicative of their relationship at this point, and kind of Hong's view of outsiders as well, how he's running things. This also coincides with a second assault on Shanghai, where Li Xiuquan brings 40,000 troops with him.
And Li Xiuquan is the East King?
He's known as the Loyal King. He's the one that told Hong to read the book.
Ah, okay, yeah.
His best friend growing up.
Right.
Crazy where they started and where they are now, right?
Started from the bottom, now we're here.
Literally. Western businessmen see the writing on the wall and begin negotiations with the Taiping without the Qing's consent in Shanghai, or without British consent either. It was the individual businessmen and their guilds were parlaying with the Taiping. But just as the Mongols were thwarted not once but twice by a typhoon on their invasion of Japan, some very, very lucky and weird weather plays a factor here, because snow starts to fall on January 26th. And this isn't crazy, it's snowed in Shanghai before, but this was the biggest snow on record to that point, ever in Shanghai. And this proves disastrous for the Taiping rebels. Lack of winter clothing, inability to move on the river. This meant that supplies couldn't get to them at all. And the Qing jumped on the opportunity to cut off these men from Nanjing. And they're just scattered, defeated. It was a rout, basically. And otherwise, many people analyze that the numbers the Taiping had would have been enough to probably take Shanghai at that time, if not for the blizzards. Yeah, just really chance of history there. Like we speculated before, if they had taken the city, they probably would have the resources to take the rest of China. Let's check back in on life in the kingdom one last time. People traveling across the Heavenly Kingdom have grown accustomed to the somber sights of destroyed homes, many of which the wood for defenses or ships have been taken and salvaged, bodies just strewn across the roads in the countryside. And while the city of Nanjing prospers, the countryside has been left to die. Villagers that have fled combat have brands of the kingdom burned to their faces. Bodies of the bloated dead litter the rivers, streams, and canals. British soldiers are shocked at the devastation that they see, and that's by British Imperial soldier standards, so it's bad.
Yeah.
They've caused a lot of it around the world.
Oh, yeah.
They also note that the Chinese people carry on, adjusting to the horrors of life, living amongst this chaos. They're still trying to live. Refugees fled to Shanghai for safety, but fearing spies, they're left out, and the defenses become a safeguard against refugees as much as it is a defense against rebels. The streets of the Bund, which is where the Europeans operate from, outside the city walls, are unwalkable at times due to the amount of sleeping women and children. Dogs and cats begin to disappear as the refugees reportedly take them for food. And in 1861, many peasants who once welcomed the Taiping formed militias against them and began raiding Taiping trade around the kingdom. By 1863, all foreigners have left Nanjing, but the supply of weapons from Shanghai from European traders only increases. And in 1863, the Taiping are faced with more defeats and bad luck in the west. Their morale is falling amongst all their armies. Hong begins to feel betrayed by those closest to him, and he feels spurned by God by all the misfortune. And when you hear about the Taiping Rebellion, you hear often 20 to 30 million dead as the number that comes up. So I just wanted to touch on where that number comes from, because we've been just kind of mentioning that there's a lot of bloodshed at these different battles and everything. But how do you get to 20 to 30 million? That's, one of the biggest conflicts in history, as we've said. But I want to explain that. So both sides had eventually resorted to total war. And as I mentioned, a city might be taken 4 to 5 times in a year. But each time a city was taken at this point, the population was massacred. Everyone was killed. And it was retaliatory, right? If the Qing did that to the Taiping, they would do the same thing when they retook the city. The battles destroyed farmland, and this farmland was the most sophisticated and productive irrigation system in the world at this point. So millions fled their homes, and famine set in across central China. Starvation and displacement created fertile grounds for epidemics. So malaria, dysentery, and other disease spread rapidly in refugee camps and in the besieged cities. And life, particularly outside of Nanjing, keep going back and forth. You guys know it's the same city. It was brutal due to the strict social codes imposed in the Heavenly Kingdom. So those who resisted the new religion in the villages were executed. Peasants were eventually conscripted into labor battalions, and entire populations were uprooted and moved to serve the needs of the state or the army. And this dislocated rural life deepened the famine. So there's a couple reports that I'd cite for this. So from Anhui province, there's a report that describes peasants so impoverished that they fled in mass into banditry or starvation. Literally every person that the British ran into were either bandits or dead.
Wow.
And a missionary account from Jiangsu province noted villagers conscripted into endless road and wall building projects, starving as their land lay uncultivated. That is how you end up with 20 to 30 million, and 5 to 10% of China's population succumbing during this time is years of that, hell on earth going on.
Yeah, wow. Just lots of things adding up and devastation. So what you're saying is, in addition to the actual murdering that happened, that meant that the conditions afterwards were ripe for disease. It meant that fields weren't being tilled. It meant that just life became a lot harder.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, we're coming sort of to the end of this Heavenly Kingdom. The West King, Shi Dakai, who had been campaigning ceaselessly from 1857 to 1863, is finally cornered and surrenders to the Qing, hoping that they'd spare him. But he was executed via slow dismemberment publicly.
Ooh.
And with the Second Opium War over in 1860, the Qing had more resources to spare and fight the Taiping rebels. France and Britain also committed to aiding the Qing, though the Taiping Rebellion had helped them as a distraction and destabilizing force during and leading up to the Second Opium War. They now needed the Qing as a stable puppet.
Right. Yeah.
And they needed the Qing to enforce their terms of these treaties that heavily favored the British and the French.
Yeah.
So they then turned on the rebels.
I mean, that's classic British divide and rule strategy, right? You break up a population, encourage them to fight amongst each other, and then just make sure you're the strongest one there and pick one that's slightly stronger than the others to nominally rule while you extract all the money you can. And
it continues today with Britain and Britain's clear successor, the US. Just ask Kurdish people how they feel about them.
Yeah, right.
Taiping cities began to fall, such as Suzhou in December of 1863. The Taiping are shown no mercy from the Qing. The generals and civilians are promised amnesty upon defeat, but then they're all slaughtered after surrender. The siege of Nanking first begins with the Qing building a 10-mile moat around the southern defenses of the city, and they used tunnels with gunpowder to break open the city walls.
Wow.
Li Shuqing, who began all of this with Hong, struggles to find the courage to tell his leader that the situation is hopeless. With supply routes cut off, there are many old people, children, and civil servants who cannot fight, but all of those people still exhaust supplies. And he tells this to Hong, but he receives this official reply because at that point, he is not allowed to see the Heavenly King face to face.
Why should I, who has been received the sacred command of God, fear anything? You can do as you like. Remain in the capital or go away. If you do not serve my invincible kingdom, there are those who will. You are afraid of death, so you may as well die.
So that's his words to his former best friend. And despite this, Li remains loyal. He tries to no effect to retake key points around the city, but ultimately fails at trying to retake these points. He's still alive, but his efforts to defend the city are not going well. The fighting goes underground as the Qing build tunnel after tunnel into the city. By spring of 1864, there's no food left in the city, but Hong replies to his people that the children of Israel survived for 40 years in Sinai with no food.
How'd that work out for them?
But there's no great fanfare at Hong Xiuquan's death. He falls ill just after his 50th birthday, and he dies on June 1st, 1864. The illness was unknown, and he would not take any remedies. It's decreed that he has visited heaven to request a celestial army to defend the city. He's buried in the ground, wrapped in a shroud of yellow silk, and Hong's 14-year-old son, Chang Gui-fu, ascends to his crumbling throne. On July 19th, 1864, the walls are finally breached, and the Qing ravage the city, looting and raping. Hong's son flees to an abandoned temple where the Qing uniforms are stashed, and he makes it out of the city, but some 20,000 people were killed in a single night. Li Shucheng, the loyal king, is leading the young king's party out of the city when his horse collapses of exhaustion on the road. He's captured by peasants who turn him in to the Qing. He begs for the people of the city to be spared, and that all the Taiping will submit and return home if they're shown mercy, but no mercy is given. The young monarch flees and evades capture, working as a farmhand for a few months, until he's finally captured on October 25th, 1864, and executed a month later. As we said before, the widely accepted death toll for the Taiping rebellions numbered between 20 and 30 million people, around 5 to 10% of China's population at the time. In the wake of the Taiping defeat, the Qing can find no solace, as their country is overrun with foreign imperialists, and China will never see the imperial strength that it did before the rise of God's Chinese son. That's our story done. But we need to discuss some lessons to be learned, or else it's just a story we told on the podcast.
Quite a story, still.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't know much about this before, so...
No, I didn't. I knew a little bit about the Opium War, but not all this stuff that's happening at the same time, which paints it in an interesting light.
And there's a lot I skipped over, so feel free to, if you're listening and want to know more, there's a lot of books on the subject. Feel free to grab the 2 that I used as my sources.
They'll be in the description of the episode.
But I think there are some lessons to be learned. The first being the power and peril of charismatic leadership, which we've touched on in other episodes. Hong's visions and his religious charisma mobilized millions of people. His ability to blend Christianity with Chinese traditions created a sense of destiny and purpose that gave ordinary peasants the courage to fight against a corrupt dynasty.
This is a tactic that's been used in other contexts very well. Shintoism is kind of like that. Like, Shintoism wasn't really a religion until sort of the Meiji Restoration. They were a collection of folk beliefs and practices across Japan, and when the Meiji were like, oh, we need like a nation state like what Europeans have, they decided they needed a Japanese religion and sort of collected these folk tales and wove them together into Shintoism.
I didn't know that about Shintoism. Yeah, I didn't know it was like a recent invention.
Relatively, I mean, so the stories are much older, but as a unified thing, it's pretty recent and kind of an imperial state building project as well.
Wow.
So it can be a very effective tool. It's just that it seems that Hong Xiuquan was not particularly ideological about it.
Yeah, I think the lesson we can learn on this front is that movements need structures of accountability, or otherwise charisma can quickly turn into tyranny, which we've seen with successful socialist projects that took power.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the list goes on.
And that's particular now, and this is an interesting case because it is the same guy that this happened to. You often hear about it with, like, when Lenin died and there was the power vacuum, and then Stalin led to this, corruption and tyranny and all of that.
Yeah. I'm kind of surprised there hasn't been like a series or a movie about this that's popular, because it's quite the story, I feel like.
Oh, yeah.
The dramatic...
I wonder if that has been in China.
I mean, they really try to forget this period.
Right, yeah.
So, like, probably not. There's a huge effort in revitalizing their, like, folk cultural stuff into video games and movies lately, but not, like, this history. I think another lesson is that we can view religion as both liberation and oppression. because the Taiping drew on Christianity to inspire equality, right? They abolished foot binding, redistributed land, raised the status of women. It gave them a moral language that empowered the poor against the elites. Yet the same theology justified the brutal purges, extreme moral codes, and intolerance to any differences in their ideology. And the lesson, I think, there is that ideology, whether religious or secular, can be a double-edged sword. Protest movements must constantly check whether their ideals are empowering the many or being weaponized to control them.
You know, I've thought about this in other contexts as well. My now former housemate, who is part-time yoga instructor, she has an office job as well, but yoga is her passion, always thought of yoga as a very sort of liberatory force, but because that's what it was for her. But then she went to a thing about decolonizing yoga and learned about how, you know, the IDF uses it so that their soldiers can feel more chilled out about murdering civilians. And even Sanskrit itself is an imperial language that was used to conquer the sort of smaller kingdoms in and around India at the time. So I suppose it is that recognition, as we've said before, and I'm sure we'll say again many times over, nothing is apolitical, right? Everything is political. And you can have these value systems, but the context in which they're applied matters and how they're applied matters. And also, we mentioned Plato and Diogenes a moment ago, this idea of Plato's idea of the golden mean, right? That any concept in too little or too great a quantity is a bad thing. Like passion is a good thing, but obsession is a bad thing. And then apathy is also a bad thing. So like passion is the golden mean between apathy and obsession, right? And so that there is this sort of thing with any value in too great or too little quantity becomes a vice. And so I think that those are much wordier ways of saying what you already said, but important to keep in mind.
I think that's insightful. And there's like two other things that I want to draw from this, and that's like the role of foreign powers within how we analyze history, because on paper they didn't play too much of a role till the end, but the British and French were there the whole time through this story, even from the spark of it all, right? And I think just the lesson we can take from that all is that outside powers rarely support revolutions unless it aligns with their own interest, right? And foreign intervention often turns the tide, but it almost never is in favor of the oppressed, I would say.
Well, it might be by coincidence.
Again, only if it suits them, right?
Yeah.
In another way.
Yeah.
And the last thing is the human cost of revolutionary violence. We've talked about that death toll, and we need to question like what methods bring change without replicating cycles of destruction. What cost do revolutions take? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't think Adam has an answer for that.
No.
It's a big question that's out there for the revolutionaries. But with that being said, let me close out our story on the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion is more than a strange footnote in China's history. It's a warning about the power and peril of revolutionary movements rooted in religion and charismatic leadership. It provides a deeper dive into the world left shaken by European dominance, and it shows us how faith can mobilize the masses against oppression, but also how it can be twisted into authoritarianism and destruction. It's a reminder that the struggle against exploitation, empire, and corruption must always be tied to democratic accountability and collective vision, not just one man's revelation. Any last thoughts, Adam?
You know, we've been through a lot of history in these couple of episodes. So my thoughts are largely around how the wheel of history turns, but not of its own accord. It is driven by people, and I think it is rare that we can know at the time what effect our actions may have, which is why it is so important to act. We need to keep pushing in the direction of the things we want to see, because it won't happen by itself. And there are people always pushing in the other direction. But, and at risk of rambling, this is why you have to have clear vision in your mind, backed by sound ideological principles that are subject to their own reflection, or else you may find yourself the brother of Jesus turned decadent emperor.
I think you bring up a good point about community as well within that. I think it's important to have true community that has your back, but also will check you, lest you become the emperor closed off to the world and insisting that your people starve and your best friends leave.
Yeah.
So just keep your friends close and trust them and listen to them when they say you're going crazy, because you probably are at that point.
Probably, yeah.
So thank you for listening, dear listener. as always, keep fighting the good fight. And I pose a challenge to our listeners. If you can share this episode with one new person, that will mean a great deal to us. And with that, Adam, can you close out this behemoth of an episode with an observation made from afar by Karl Marx in the New York Daily Tribune in 1853 about the Taiping Rebellion?
Whatever may be the peculiar character of the religious notions of the insurgents, their social program is of the most radical kind. It is communism in its rudest form. I was not expecting that from the man himself. Wow. Okay, that puts a whole spin on it right at the end. I'm going to go away thinking about this, reading these books. You've sent me away with even more homework than we went in with. How could you do this to me, Sam?
I mean, please note the date. It was like right when he conquered Nanking.
This is true. 1853. We're all good.